You could hear in the president's speech last night, you could hear in this meeting today, there is alignment about protecting democracy. We know that Black Americans are among the hardest working, most patriotic people in this country. And we need a democracy that works for Black America and that works for all of America. And we need a democracy that does not condone, allow, or facilitate attacks on its own people, whether that be through voter suppression, whether that be what we saw during the January 6th insurrection, whether that be through police and state violence, or whether that be through white supremacy, which drives a lot of what we're seeing. And so that alignment with the president is there. What we need to do is use political muscle in the civil rights community and also among elected officials to push this agenda forward.
That was civil rights attorney Damon Hewitt, who, along with leaders of 7 other Black-led civil rights organizations, declared a state of emergency for democracy earlier this week. Those leaders met with President Biden today on the heels of the president's own stark warning last night about the growing threat to democracy from authoritarian and white supremacist forces in the Republican Party. Joining us now is Damon Hewitt, the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Mr. Hewitt, thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
So I want to get your thoughts on this sort of very careful needle the president was trying to thread in his remarks last night. He said repeatedly there is a difference between Republicans and MAGA Republicans. And then you look at polling on one of the sort of most basic things in our democracy, the right to vote, and what happened in the 2020 election. I think it's something like 70% of Republicans say they don't think Joe Biden is a legitimate winner of the 2020 election. Do you think people of color see a difference between Republicans and MAGA Republicans?
Well, look, I think that people of color, we can make fine distinctions and see differences. We know who's for us and who's against us, number one. And that does not always stay within the ranks of a certain single party. It's really about who uses their leverage, their sweat equity, their capital towards the interests of Black America, and in this case, towards the interests of democracy. And so I think there's a pretty clear distinction about who does and who does not.
What did you think? Who do you think was the intended audience of the president's remarks last night? On one hand, you would think it's some of those middle-of-the-road Republicans, and yet the response almost uniformly from the Republican Party and from conservatives today has been one of unrelenting criticism. They say that President Biden has, in some ways, galvanized, I think, the right wing to organize against him. Where is the change supposed to happen? Go ahead.
Right. Those are desperate pleas. I heard the president speaking to multiple audiences. He was speaking to his base to let them know that he understands and sees what's happening, and he's not willing just to play nice and sit by and allow it to happen. He was speaking to what's left of the movable middle to say, if you actually care about this country, then you should actually listen to what I have to say. You should follow the policy direction that I'm taking. And he was also speaking to people you may call the never Trumpers out there, I'm sure. There's a big question mark, obviously, as to whether those people will swing his way again. But I think he was also speaking to us in the civil rights and advocacy community, because we are in multiple fights on multiple fronts. And we need to see this president standing up and calling it like it is. And that's exactly what we saw in such an eloquent way last night.
And then you had some time with the president today, right? I mean, this is a meeting that is many ways following up on what the president talked about, but also it dovetails with the work that you guys are doing as a coalition. What was the meeting about, and what's the plan to save democracy? Because we all want to know.
Right. Well, this was a part of a series of meetings with the civil rights community that's been planned since this president and vice president took office. So it's not a surprise that we're meeting. We will be there again, and we'll talk about it again. But today, messages coalesced around a broad sense of what it takes to protect democracy and the very fact that democracy is under threat. At the Lawyers Committee, we talk a lot about the promises of democracy. It's about economic opportunity and the notion of not just having a living wage, but having a chance at prosperity. Just the simple fact of being able to cast a ballot, have that vote count, and have the winner of the election actually be seated. Concepts that should not be novel. And so we talked about today a broad notion of what democracy means, what it takes to protect it. And there are some areas of contest in terms of what the best pressure points should be and what the right policies should be. But overall, there was strong alignment that bringing to America, bringing to Black America, to Brown America, to America overall, a message about the importance of preserving democracy is of utmost importance right now.
Is any of that, the conversation is occurring, but in terms of an action plan, is there anything that can be executed before the midterms? Because I think a lot of people are terrified about what happens in November.
That's right. So like legislative proposals did not move the John Lewis Voter Rights Advancement Act and the like, electoral, Counts Act reform, what have you. But the president did issue an executive order on voting, on elections. And that executive order, among other things, allows federal agencies or enlists federal agencies in the mission of getting voters registered. We need to see more uptake from federal agencies. My understanding is that as of late spring, early summer, only 2 federal agencies had signed up to make sure that all of their offices around the country were voter registration sites. We need to change that. We need to mobilize and do what's possible in terms of election monitoring. There are some severe limitations on DOJ now after the Shelby decision in 2013. But some state AGs are now empowered to do things of that sort. You saw favorable laws in Virginia, New York. Of course, those are not states in the Deep South, which are very concerned. But there are buttons that can be pushed. And also, we're mobilizing in civil society. At the Lawyers Committee, we convened the National Election Protection Coalition. Our election protection hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, is operating every single day with expanded hours as we approach Election Day. So we have to move and shake in so many ways. There's no easy button, Alex. There's no one federal prescription at this point, especially without legislation. I will say this, however. President Biden expressed a significant openness and eagerness even today to try again on federal voting rights legislation that will protect the right to vote. Of course, that's not likely to happen in this Congress. And in fact, the election this fall, really a lot hangs in the balance in terms of those results. But he expressed an openness and an eagerness to make a renewed push.
A lot does hang in the balance, and that is an understatement. Damon Hewitt, the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Keep fighting the good fight, please, Mr. Hewitt. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Every day, Alex. Thanks so much.